So I'm now going to go back to Bridge, and I'm going to select these three images. And as I did before, I'm going to go to Tools, Photoshop, Load Files into Photoshop Layer. And it does. And as I did before, I'm going to tell it I want to create a frame animation. And I'm going to make frames from layers. And you can see the three. Now, one of the things, and we talked about this with the last series of image, but note that it's just the way that Photoshop lays this in, that top to bottom here in the layers panel is reversed from what you see here. So there's no reason, just because I think it helps me logically keep things organized with more complex GIF designs, to reverse that. So now, top to bottom here, left to right here in the image sequence, I think makes a little bit more sense. So right off the bat, I'm going to set up each one of these to play for 1 second. And I'm going to tell it to play 3 times. Except for I made a mistake. And I'm going to tell it to play 3 times. And what I really want to do in this final segment of the photo video is talk a little bit more about text behavior, and tweening. Before we talk about tweening, I'll again, as I did before, making sure I'm on the topmost layer, I'm going to add test text again. Right. So you can see, that's what we did before. Now, what if, let us say, that we want the text to appear to move from frame left to frame right for some reason, like ticker tape style. In a moment, we'll talk about tweening, which is essentially allowing Photoshop to automate an animated behavior. But in some cases, and this may be one of them, it might be easier to do it yourself. So here's, just as a demonstration, I want to show you this real quickly. The first thing I'm going to do is duplicate each of the 3 pictures twice. And for demonstration purposes, I'm not adding more images than I absolutely need to. If I made more frames, it would run more smoothly. Right? So going back to the first frame, I'm going to pick up the text and move it here. Right? I'm going to go to the second frame, and I'm going to move it over just a little bit here. And I am not, for the purpose of demonstration, using some of the grid guidelines just to make sure that this is perfectly smooth. Now, one of the things that you can see is on each new frame, it's displaying the text in the original position. And I know my spacing is going to be off on this, but that's okay for what we're doing now. So again, note the relationship between that overlay layer and the behavior of each frame. Now if I play my GIF, I'm getting a behavior out of the text. And again, this is not intended to be an especially aesthetically pleasing choice or even that technically proficient, but I do want to illustrate for you this process. So now let me demonstrate one more thing before we close at this point. I'm actually, for the purposes of this, I'm going to delete, you can see this little trash can, the frames, the extra frames I created for the purposes of this demonstration. And what I'm going to ask Photoshop to do is essentially automate a version of what I did just now manually. And that when you ask Photoshop to do it, it's called tweening. So I'm going to go back to this original image. And one of the things that we talk a little bit about before, that where text appears in the stack defines how it will play in your GIF. So I'm actually going to move this text from the top of the stack down to just above that final image, right? So now when I play my GIF, right, it just shows up on that last image. Right? So I'm going to center it here on this last image. And what I'm going to do is sort of genuine tweeting. What I'm going to ask, first I'm going to set this up so it plays only once. And what I want to do, because I think when you play it now, you'll see that when that text pops up, it's kind of abrupt. So I'm going to basically ask Photoshop to tween this for me, to make that text fade in, right? So to do that, I'm going to have to duplicate this image, right? Because the tweening behavior is from frame to frame. So I need an image to have an image where this process begins and a second image where this process is going to end. So on image number 3, right, I'm going to want the text not to appear at all, to not see it all. Then I'm going to want it to fade in as I get to that final image. And keep in mind, from the viewer's perspective, they don't know that it's moving from one image to another. They just see the text changing. And we'll change and combine the total playtime of these final 2 images to be the same as the previous 3, so the sequencing, the tempo is consistent. But here I am on this image. So now I'm going to go over here to the far right to the fill field, and I'm going to reduce this, right? And I'm not removing the text, but you can see as I get down to 0 fill, it disappears, right? Now on the 4th image, you can see the text is there, 100% fill. So I'm going to select these 2 images. I'm holding down the Shift key, and I'm going to tell Photoshop essentially to create frames between those 2 frames, to do it automatically, that's going to sort of accommodate and build in that fade, right? So tween. Now in this screen, I'm telling it to tween between the selected images, to add 5 frames. I'm actually going to reduce this number, and this number is going to change depending on what you want to do, to tween all layers. In other words, I'm not distinguishing between frames and layers here. And part of tweening, in addition to opacity, which is what we're working on, you could automate that text movement that I demonstrated manually. You could automate special effects to whatever things you want to tween or whatever behaviors you want your GIF to have. This is just a basic introduction. Now I'm going to hit OK, right? And you can see it added those frames to allow the tweening effect. So now that we've tweened this image, let's go back for a minute to the rocket. And if you remember from this tutorial, what we did in this case was we created 4 layers. We manually, using place embed, pasted in a rocket and moved it, and then created 4 frames from those layers. Well, what should be kind of clear to you now is, in fact, very often it's easier just to use this tweening feature. So if you watch, I can create a second frame here. With that frame selected, I move the rocket up to the final position. I select both frames, and then I just tell it to add 2 frame layers. And now I've essentially automated that effect. And obviously this works really well with the rocket. It may not be appropriate for all GIFs. It may not be worth it for some GIFs, like the sprockets or the cogs GIF, where because some of the sprockets are moving clockwise and some are interlaced and moving counterclockwise, that one had to be done manually. So let's go back to the photographs. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to, because each one of these 2 images is 1 second, I'm going to make the total time that these 5 frames play 1 second. So each one is going to be 1/5 of a second, so that the time as far as the viewer is concerned for each image is the same. And now I'll play it again. Right? And again, you could make this play more smoothly. You could do a variety of things with it, but this is just a demonstration of the basic technique. So one last thing to point out before we close out this video, and that has to do with export. So I'm going to, as we've done in the past, I'm going to sort of basically test it. I'm going to save for web. And this is going to give me this preview window. Take it a second to load. And you can see here that this is a pretty big image. And when I preview it, It's too big for this screen. And this, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is, when you're bringing things into Photoshop, particularly images or video that have been shot at either HD or very large file size, you need to make sure that the dimensions, the overall size at which it's going to display, can be accommodated by the screen or be accommodated by the space allowed for it in whatever template that your GIF is going to play. So in this case, if I go to image size in Photoshop, I can see that this is a very big image. This is almost a full HD image. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to make it 800 pixels along the longest edge. I don't have sort of a template. I don't know exactly how big this GIF would be used, but 800 is a nice kind of round figure. So I'm going to hit OK. And it appears smaller in the window as a percentage of the overall file size. But again, now you can see if I preview it, it's more likely to play at a usable size in anybody's web browser, no matter screen size or format, at about 800 pixels. Might be smaller, dimensions might change, but that's at least an introduction. So with that, we'll end this tutorial on photos, text tweening. The next video will sort of take it to the next step, which is video with a combined element of photo as an overlay or mask to give it that sort of, in the context of a GIF, that cinematograph effect. Thank you.